Okay,
Exactly
so with that, let's talk about, you've insisted a number of times that the climate narrative is a religious or quasi-religious structure. So why don't you, I've got some thoughts about that, which I'll share eventually, but I would like you to lay out why you use that terminology specifically.
Yeah, so I mean that in two senses. Worse is the sense in which it is a religious institution gone awry. And then the second is in which it fills a psychological need for religion and God in the everyday person. On the first of those, just as you were laying out the philosophical framing of it, I was reminded of actually one of my favorite stories about Christ, actually, which came from not the Bible, but from Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov, Brothers K, in his chapter entitled The Grand Inquisitor, actually. And it tells the story of how Christ comes back to earth during the 15th or 16th century or whatever in Seville, Spain. He's walking the streets, performing miracles, and then the Grand Inquisitor, a person leading the Spanish Inquisition, spots him on the street and has him arrested. And the whole climax of the chapter is the dialogue between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor. And what the Grand Inquisitor tells Christ is, look, we the church don't need you here anymore. You are supposed to be a symbol that helps us do our work, but your presence here actually stops us from getting our work done. And he sentences Christ to execution the next morning. Swapping climate for Christ, which really is what's happening in the psychological minds of people who are buying this religion up, which I'll get to in a second, but that's also what's going on here, is the climate's just an excuse. And in fact, once you get into a discussion about actually addressing carbon emissions, say with nuclear energy, they get very worried. So they're sentencing nuclear energy to death because that's their messiah and their savior, right? You said you wanted to actually get rid of carbon emissions. Well, you would welcome the second coming of Christ, the second coming of the climate solution of nuclear energy. No. They sentence it to death because as the Grand Inquisitor told Christ in that story, your presence here actually impedes our work. You're just supposed to be a symbol for us. So in a certain sense, it has a religious quality in terms of the church that protects its own turf, even from the very God that it tells its parishioners to worship. Now, the second question, though, is why are the parishioners worshiping at all? And I think this gets to the heart of, in a weird way, my candidacy for president of the United States, even though we're in deep philosophical terrain here. I just think we're in the middle of this identity crisis where we are so hungry for purpose and meaning and identity as Americans and it's probably true for much of the Western world too, even beyond America, but we're so hungry for a cause at a moment in our history when the things that used to fill that void, faith is one of them. Faith in God is a big one. But patriotism is also a big one. National identity is big. Family is also pretty big in this category. Even hard work, actually. We can get into that later, but these are sources of identity, sources of pride, sources of grounding. They're grounded in truth. And the way I look at us as human beings, I mean, this is a first personal reflection, right? We're like blind bats. We're lost in some cave in an abyss, and we send out these sonar signals for our echolocation of identity, right? We can't see where we are, but we deduce where we are by bouncing off the signals we send and get them back as sources of truth. Okay, I send a signal out, family is one source of identity I get back. God is another source of identity I get back. My nation is another source of identity I get back. My hard work, the things I create in the world, these things, we deduce our identity, and it tells us, even though we're blind, where we are, lost in that abyss. But when those things disappear, we send out that signal, and then nothing comes back. And then we're lost. And so then we start grasping at artificial sources of that identity, racial identity, gender identity. Where do you think this bizarre gender ideology happens to have arisen from? Climate, disaster, catastrophism. That's a source of identity too. Climate instead of Christ. And so it's no accident that we see all of these secular religions arise at the same time. Why do we see wokeism at the same time as we see radical gender ideology, racial wokeism as gender ideology, as climatism, as COVIDism? It's a symptom of that deeper abyss that we're lost in. And so, that's what I care about. You broke this out